Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and it's time for another Breakfast with Blaha. And today, I'm having fat-free Greek yogurt and almond butter. All right, let's talk a little bit about deadlift and hypertrophy. The topic that over the years I've held both ends of the spectrum on, and the longer I coach, the longer I train, the more I dig into the scientific literature, I actually come to the conclusion that both are right. Both ideas are right. They just have to be implemented differently regarding if you should just use deadlift as, things like max effort, speed work. Don't do a lot of specificity. Don't try to use it for hypertrophy because it's just so hard on recovery, or if you can use it as a very powerful and valid hypertrophy tool. Right? I've tended to hold both positions over the years. And that is one to where people say, well, you're guilty of flip-flop. Okay, that one I probably am. I have come around to the point of realizing the reason I flip-flopped on it is because both sides of the argument hold merit and they both work. And that's the thing. They both work. They're both viable. I've coached people both ways at this point and very successfully. I've used both methods successfully, of low specificity to build elite deadlifts and then high specificity deadlifting to build an elite deadlift and to use it for hypertrophy. So we get the idea. So where does the idea come from that we can't use it for hypertrophy? Certain bodybuilding circles. Yet ironically, many Mr. Olympians were big deadlifters. A lot of it comes, though, from the work of guys like, because I don't want to pin this all on Dr. Mike Israetel, who says, well, the stimulus to fatigue is so high, or people who say, well, it's a lot of partials. All right, that's all well and good, but that's theoretical. That's not what the data shows. And this is where we run into problems. Because the data suggests to us that deadlift hits a lot of muscles real hard with a high degree of stimulus. The hypertrophy studies suggest that it is one hell of a hypertrophy exercise when it's actually been measured, which has been very, very little. But when it is a serious muscle builder. Issue is the recovery, which we'll get to in a minute. The recovery really is the problem. And there is merit to that idea. So what do I mean muscle activation? Look at all the EMG studies. Look at EMG studies. Look at things like glutes or hamstrings or the rectus femoris, lats. And I'm not saying EMGs are the be-all, end-all, but when you have an exercise that beats a lot of conventional movements, like the deadlift, on EMG activation for certain muscles, you have to take it seriously. You can't say, well, that's just this high activation, or there may not be any growth. You can't say there's no growth. You could say that activation may not represent optimal muscle fiber recruitment from a hypertrophic perspective. It may not be optimal. That's fair. But you can never say that very high EMG activation will occur in an exercise that's going to cause no hypertrophy, no significant hypertrophy, or not good hypertrophy of a muscle. In other words, if we ignored that data, we would then just say, well, pull-ups and chin-ups aren't good for lats and biceps. Sure, the EMG shows it hits them super hard. Yeah, it does. But some of them show deadlifts hit lats harder than these movements do. Yeah. Things like hamstrings. The hamstring activation on a conventional deadlift is monstrous on an EMG. Surprisingly, the rectus femoris or the quads in some studies, it's pretty high. Not the whole quad, but definitely the rectus femoris. All right. There's a lot of hypertrophy potential here. Guys who do a lot of deadlifting tend to have big traps, even if they don't train them a lot. What about hypertrophy research? Well, I went through a study that compared the squat and the deadlift and people who already had some lifting experience. And they did a study and they both showed significant muscle growth, but this was doing rep work, doing just a squat program and a deadlift program. And then seeing how strong they got in something like a DEXA scan, looking at their muscle growth. The deadlift group gained more muscle than the squat group. More total muscle. Now, it didn't break it down by body part because it just did a DEXA scan, and probably a lot of that was back and everything. But the fact of the matter is, it beat the squat. It wasn't by a lot. But when we're talking muscle growth, any difference, it's got to be noted. Most people out there do agree, experts, a lot of these same evidence-based people agree the squat will put a lot of muscle on you. The only study we had comparing a deadlift with a squat for hypertrophy, the deadlift won. Okay. This is good evidence that it works for hypertrophy. The issue is the recovery end. You have to program it intelligently. You have to program it intelligently. And for a lot of lifters who don't know how to hold back, or they're out of shape, it can become a problem quickly. And I prefer conjugate for some of them. All right? And we don't do rep work on the deadlifts. We do speed work and max work. It works great. But when we come over, if we do want to use it for hypertrophy purposes, a couple things you have to keep in mind. Number one, you do not grind reps. Right? You have to program the volume on it to where you are not grinding. You cannot hit failure. Failure on a deadlift when you're using training volumes that can induce hypertrophy, grinding reps to where you see serious technical breakdown, it'll destroy your recovery. It will beat you up. You're not going to be able to train correctly as a result of this. The other thing to think about, it is very, very, very fatiguing on your recovery. So if you're coming in doing 5 work sets of deadlifts, guess what? 5 or 6 sets of real sets of deadlifts. I mean, even if there's reps in reserve, these are real sets. You've got to mitigate the rest of your training. You can't use the deadlift as a hypertrophy tool if you're going to pursue programming to where you're training everything at extremely high volumes. It's not going to work. It works when you balance stuff and say, okay, we just need appropriate volumes to get close to maximum hypertrophy on everything. We don't have to push the bleeding edge. Okay, because if you're going to program the bleeding edge and you try to use deadlift as a hypertrophy tool in the mix, your overall recovery is going to be a problem. You're going to have to pay close attention to the recovery of everything else that you do around it. And that's the key to making it work. And it does work. And both groups are right. Right? I've built an elite deadlift in myself and in clients using both methods. They have their pros and cons. But the deadlift can be a valuable hypertrophy tool. It can be an amazing hypertrophy tool, but you don't have a lot of wiggle room for error on the programming end. You better know what you're doing. And you better be conservative. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.